Hello. Today we will look at prehistoric art of India, and particularly at 𝗵𝗵𝗀𝗃, at a place called 𝗵𝗵𝗃 in Madhya Pradesh, India. And after that we will also look at Indus Valley civilization, one of the first civilizations existed in the Indian region. So what is prehistoric art in India? How did it existed, and where did it exist? So it was discovered, if you look at prehistoric cave paintings, particularly prehistoric art. When we say prehistoric art, the examples that we get largely are of cave paintings. There have been some mobile small objects that are carved, but we don't quite get them in the context of India. There are examples that come later, but for today we will look at 𝗵𝗵𝗃𝗃 and the cave paintings. What are the kinds of cave paintings happened, and what are the images that we get to see, and how they have done. When did 𝗵𝗵𝗃𝗃 got discovered? It got discovered in 1957. Accidentally, people stumbled on this cave, rock shelters, and then when they entered, they discovered that there are fantastic paintings, and so they went inside and then started researching and then started dating them. So rock cut shelters of 𝗵𝗵𝗃𝗃 were dated from 9000 BC to 7000 BC. So that was the time that we can see the images of paintings could be dated, and but the rock cut shelters existed. I mean, Homo erecticus. Homo erecticus is the form of the earliest human beings. Okay, so before the formation of Homo sapiens, you have the form of Homo erecticus. So the presence of Homo erecticus, that means the earliest form of the human being, existed around 30,000 BC at that place. But what we get to see in terms of cave paintings that are dated slightly later, though we have some remnants, remnants that are under the layers of the later paintings. We have some remnants of paintings dating back to around 30,000 or around that time, 30,000 BC or around that time. So, so there are 5 groups of rock shelters in 𝗵𝗵𝗃𝗃. So the term 𝗵𝗵𝗃𝗃 is derived from 𝗵𝗵𝗃. So 𝗵𝗵𝗃, Bhim is the mythological figure, the divine figure from the epic Mahabharata, an important figure, one of the Pandavas, as we know. So it is believed that there is some relation between Bhim as well as that place. So the place is named after him and it is called 𝗵𝗵𝗃𝗃. So there are 5 groups of rock shelters and each of them has a very interesting and complicated painting. We assume that rock cut paintings are, these early paintings are very simple, very geometric, and not very complicated. But if you actually look into the composition, if you actually look into the logic of these paintings, you see it's very complicated. It's actually a kind of a language we can see operating in those compositions, in those arrangements. And what you have in these paintings, like cave paintings in other regions, the cave paintings in 𝗵𝗵𝗃𝗃 also have different layers. So there are places where you have 20 layers of painting done across the time period, across different times and years and ages. So the cavemen used to paint on the already existing image. So there are assumptions, there are speculations about why, though you have empty space throughout the cave, why only at some pockets you have a concentrated images and a concentrated imagery, why cavemen chose to paint in that particular area. So there are stories, I mean there are speculations that maybe if once the painting is done, once a sort of a painting is done, the paintings largely of hunting scenes initially. So if the hunt was successful after that painting, and they started believing that, okay, this place has some kind of an effect, some kind of a lucky region, I mean this is lucky for us, so maybe we should paint again and again to achieve the same luck. This is one of the speculations that they might have, I mean speculations by the later historians and art historians, thinking that they might have thought in this manner, but we don't actually know if they have thought in that particular process, in that particular manner. So they are dated, I mean these particular cave paintings are dated back to the Mesolithic period, and across, I mean from Mesolithic period, these paintings run into, I mean they run into the historical period. So they date, I mean they span a long period, and we can see, we can actually see historians have divided these paintings into some 4 phases: the early phase, later phase, early phase, middle phase, later phase, and the historical phase. So the historical phase is the time when the historical period already has started, but still cave painting happened, and it went into the medieval period. So the time period of cave painting at Bhimbetka is really a long time period. So we will look at some of the examples today and then see how changes can be located, can be observed in the paintings. So what materials did they use? Before going into the images, let us see what materials they got to use. What they have found at hand were the earth colors, right? So the colors that we get to see on cave paintings on these cave paintings are white, yellow, orange, red, red ochre, purple, brown, green, and black. So black is obviously coming from charcoal. You have red. Red is nothing but 𝗬𝗚, that we use for different purposes. Hematite, which is hematite, and brown that they might have got from the earth colors. Green and various colors they have found around that region, around that place, and then they have ground them. They have made powder, and then they have used them for painting. So white and red we see are recurring colors. We see white and red continues to exist from earlier to later phase, though there are other colors added to it. Apart from the colors, they have used gum, because gum or resin from trees or animal fat, and so they would mix these gum or resin from the trees and animal fat, and then they would paint. I mean, because you need a binding material for the powder to paint on the surface of the cave. So they would use the gum or fat, animal fat, for as the binding material. And white probably was limestone that they found abundantly around. So limestone was white, and green was prepared from a rock called 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪. 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪 was available around that region. So green was made out of this particular rock, and brushes were made out of the plant fiber. So you have plants, and you make out of, like, using the plant fiber, you make brushes. So charcoal brushes were the larger, I mean the tools along with the colors to paint them. So these are the tools and the materials with which they have painted the cave images, the images in the caves. So but one can ask the question that, why and how come after all these years we still have these paintings intact? And scientists believe and historians believe, and through certain, how does this dating happen? Dating is done using carbon dating technique. It's one of the techniques used by the archaeologists to date a particular archaeological object. So these cave paintings were also dated using carbon dating, and using different scientific and chemical methodologies, they have understood that it is because of the oxidization chemical reaction of the oxide that is present on the surface of the rocks. Because of that reaction with the colors, the color became very permanent. So which is why we get to see even now with with a very good amount of freshness of color, we have the paintings intact. So 𝗵𝗵𝗃𝗀, as I said, we have around 20 layers of paintings over one, on top of the other. So we have seen why, we have discussed why that could be the case, and we'll see some examples like how it appears, how it looks. So this is an example from the early phase, the first period, where you see a boar, a horned boar is attacking a man. And if you look at the boar, the horned boar, it is painted in bigger dimensions and it is ferocious. So, but if you look at the human figure, the human figures are schematic. It is drawn with minimal number of lines. It's just a stick figure, right? So this tells us that the man at that point of time was more focused on animal and its power, the power of the animal, or how to capture the animal, or the fear of the animal. So animal assumed this central position in the cave paintings, and we can see animals continue to exist from the earlier stage to later stage, even when the human figures and the community is reflected in the cave paintings. So this is one of the early examples, one of the examples of the early phase of cave paintings. This is also an early phase, and it's interesting in the sense, again, the animal is occupying the central focus, where the animal is painted with its volume, with a sense of dimension. In terms of scale also, you see the animal which could be a bull or a buffalo, not buffalo, maybe it should be a bull. And interestingly, you have on the surface of the bull, it is a flat two-dimensional surface, and they have decorated, the body of the bull is decorated with straight lines, and it's more like a geometric ornamentation. So they have not only, it's not just a functional aspect of painting, representing animals and maybe representing hunt or planning a hunt on the surface of the cave, but while they are doing it, they are painting the animal with some kind of a ritualistic intensity, in the sense they are not painting animal just for the sake of painting an animal and for the sake of hunt, but they are decorating the animal. So it's almost like you are ritually decorating the animal, and the ritualistic dimension is very important, which I think we can see continues in the tribal cultures, even in the village cultures that we have now. This ritual around animals and animals participating in the rituals is very much visible even now. So it's a very interesting example. And if you look at the background, you have human figures engaged in some sort of an action, and this action, the action could be related to hunt maybe. So but the human figures and the focus of human figures, the amount of concentration, the amount of emphasis that is paid to human figures is very less than the amount of emphasis and focus that is paid to the animal. So the human figures in the first stage, in the early stage, are represented with this schematic sort of a representation. But the interesting aspect about here is the human figures carry certain sense of animation, and you see that there are figures who are running, there are figures who are moving forward. So I mean, the cavemen could capture this sense of movement and animation of the human figure. So this is an example where you have multiple animals and animals moving. You have deers, you have different kinds of animals, you have buffaloes, you have bulls, and so, and you have different colors here, unlike the earlier image where you saw only red, only 𝗬𝗄 is used. Here you have white and different other colors are used, and you also can see layers here. And it is unlike one single animal, you have multiple animals and the animals are moving. So it's like a flock of animals, it's like a group of animals, and maybe it is a hunt, or maybe by that time, because this is falling more or less in the middle phase of the Bhimbetka cave paintings, by then you have gathering of animals, domestication of animals was taking place. So maybe at this point of time we see it is not the hunt very much, but the civilizational process emerged. So the initial stages of civilizational process could be seen reflected, and we'll see in the later images where wars and communities of humans could be seen painted. So the gradual development, it shows the gradual development of human being from period to period. Human being not only in terms of the society and culture, not only in the sense of the community that they were forming gradually, but also in the pictorial representations. So the symbolism is inspiration from nature along with slight spirituality. So the dimension of spirituality sort of interestingly transforms from the earlier ritualistic aspect to the later, though ritualistic, but it becomes more social, it becomes more communitarian. That is an interesting dimension here. So expression of ideas through very few drawings. So unlike the earlier ornamentation, later we have a more sophisticated sort of a more organized sort of a compositions or arrangement of forms takes place. So scenes were mainly hunting and economic and social life of people. As I was mentioning, that from the middle phase onwards we see a sort of a social life where it is not only hunting, but you also have community gathering, you also have social life, you also have sometimes dance and different activities. So the figure of flora, fauna, human mythical creatures, carts, chariots, etc. So you don't only have animals, the forms have increased in the paintings gradually. So this shows a sort of an evolution not only in the cave paintings. The cave paintings reflects the evolution of the man also, evolution of the community and the social life of the community. So what we can understand by this is when we look at artworks, when we look at the examples of images, examples of paintings or any art object that we call art object, that is related to the ancient times or prehistoric times or historic times, the art object or the painting or whatever, the painting surface or the object itself, it is not just a matter of art, but it reflects, we can read many things into it. When you look at it, it tells many stories, how about the society, about the culture at that point of time, about the kind of rituals and different other social realities we can actually read into these images and objects. So like for example this, where you have a horseman and you have people around. So maybe this horseman is the leader of the community and you have 2-3 colors used here. But interestingly, what you see here is the evolution of the representation of man. Unlike the stick figures that you have seen in the first phase, here the human figure acquires a more geometric representation where you have 2 triangles arranged for the body, for example, and the body of the human figure assumes a sense of dimension here and a sense of volume. So this is a sort of an evolution from the stick figures to a more geometric sort of representation. And if you have seen this, if you have seen something called 𝗹𝗁𝗺 painting, just a distant comparison. In 𝗹𝗁𝗺 painting, 𝗹𝗁𝗺 is a tribe that survives in Maharashtra, belongs to Maharashtra, and they use geometric figure type for human figures. So it's very similar to what we see here in 𝗵𝗵𝗀𝗃, just a sort of a comparison. There is no direct link, but just a visual comparison one can make. And many of the horses that you see, the kind of horse that you see here, it can be seen continued in the tribal and folk arts of Madhya Pradesh particularly. If you look at the contemporary folk art and tribal art, you see this form of horse existing in the contemporary traditional and tribal arts. So this is an interesting image where you have a war scene represented, where two horsemen are engaged in throwing a spear, and you have figures engaged in throwing spears and arrows. So, so this is a war scene, and so if you compare from the earlier to with the earlier images, you see there's a lot of evolution, not only in terms of the evolution of representation of human figure and the evolution of representing a social life and community, but the animation of the figures, the sense of animation has increased, and the sense of animation and its representation acquired certain skill, certain intricacy. And if you look here, the human figures are more detailedly done in the sense that it is not geometric anymore, but the geometric shape of the body acquires a more physiognomic, more anthropomorphic, more human-like body. So it is a later phase, it is a phase that comes contact. So this is happening when the cavemen were in contact with the communities around, and the inter-community rivalries and all the kinds of wars. And this is also time when does war happen? War happen because you have to save your community, when the clashes happen between the communities. So this is the time when slowly settlements were happening. So this is another interesting example. So this is a very intricate, little more detailed painting, as you can see. The horse is very detailedly painted, and it's quite sophisticated. It's well developed in terms of representation in relation to 𝗵𝗵𝗃𝗃 paintings. The horse is painted in two colors, unlike the earlier horses, and the horse is more sophisticated in look. You have the horse bending forward, and it is not running, but it is bending forward. And the horseman is also painted in two colors. So definitely, again, this looks like a scene of war, or the leader of the clan is directing someone. So it's about the social scene. It is about the scene of the war that is attached with the community. And you have other two figures down there, where the horse is painted almost in the similar manner the way you see the horse painted on the top, but the horse is in the reverse. But the horse is not so sophisticatedly painted in terms of colors. But if you look at the gestures of the horse, the gesture of the horse, it is the same as the top one. So if you look at this evolves into a particular schema. This is the kind of horse, this is the type of horse that we see that continues to be painted in this stage, in the later stage. So you have this particular kind of horse where the horse looks like bending forward, one leg forward, and it is not running, but it is static. But the bent forward and one leg forward creates a sense of movement and a sense of animation. So this type, this particular type, continues to be painted in the 𝗵𝗵𝗃𝗃 cave paintings. And this particular type of horse we can see used or represented in different forms, not only in painting but sculpture, metal sculpture in Madhya Pradesh. If you visit Madhya Pradesh, you can see this particular horse, and its shape can be seen reflected in many other forms. So so the form continues into the later historical period also. So what we have seen in this particular small discussion about 𝗵𝗵𝗀𝗃 is how the form changes, what kind of pain, what kind of preoccupation was there with the cavemen from early to later. In the initial stages it was only about hunting, it is about the ritual of hunting, but later gradually as we can see, the evolution of man happens, evolution of civilization happens, the gradual settlement happens. You see a refinement of representation also happens, a more complex representation of forms of animals as well as human figures. You see a sense of development, a sense of improvement, a sense of maturity in the paintings, but the methods and techniques of painting stayed unchanged. They used same colors, they used same plant fiber for brushes, but they continued painting into the medieval times. So now let us shift to the civilization, the first civilization of India, the ancient civilization of India, what is said as the ancient civilization of India, Indus Valley civilization. Indus Valley civilization can be divided into three phases. The early phase, so you have different cities discovered, excavated in this particular region. And why is it called Indus Valley? Because there was a river called Indus that flowed from Himalaya, and along the river, because if you see any early civilization, you take Mesopotamian, you take Egyptian, you take Asian, so all these civilizations have evolved, developed along the river because you need water for agriculture. So unlike the hunting and food gatherer men, you have, in the context of the early civilizational process, agriculture is the reason for man to settle down. So the settlements happen because of the agriculture, because you cannot move from one place to another if you are actually cultivating. So it is in this process that civilizations evolve. So wherever you have rivers flowing and rivers would flood, so whenever rivers would flood, they would bring to the land a very fertile silt. So this silt is very good for cultivation. So Indus Valley civilization emerged at this around the river Indus, and Indus had brought a very fertile silt to the land around. So it was very fertile, and Indus Valley civilization was one of the greatest civilization, as historians would say, and one of the more sophisticated civilizations in terms of culture, in terms of city planning, in terms of architecture and other forms of living. So let us see now with some images and try to understand how sophisticated the Indus Valley civilization was. So we can divide it into three phases. One is, the first phase is 3300 BC to 2600 BC. The second phase, which is the matured phase, which is 2600 BC to 1700 BC. And then the late phase is 1700 BC to 1300 BC, and after that Indus Valley civilization collapsed, and there are speculations, there are assumptions and different kinds of stories that we have assumed by historians, saying that there might have been a earthquake, or the Indus stopped flowing in that direction, or there was a drought, or there was an attack from the external enemy. So we don't know. These are different speculations about the end of Indus Valley civilization. So, so this is the map of where we can locate Indus Valley civilization. So it existed in the region, in the western region, northwestern region of Indian map, and it existed in the present Pakistan and that border area where Indus flew, and that is the location of Indus Valley civilization. And if you compare, the comparable civilization at that point of time was Mesopotamian civilization, which emerged along the river Tigris and Euphrates. And as you know, Egypt emerged along the river Nile. So river, as you know, plays an important role in terms of the civilizational process, right? So civilization means structuring. Civilization means formation of a structured society. So the structured society in terms of the social values, in terms of the social classes, social structure, in terms of the organization of different activities, work activities. You have farmers, you have scholars, you have different professions like pottery or carpenter, or so this organization of society happened during this time in India. This is the first, early phase of civilization in India. So Indian Harappan phase. So Indus Valley civilization, there were many cities and it was urban centric civilization. Archaeologists have discovered over 1,000 cities around Indus Valley, and the major cities are Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. There are other cities like you have Dholavira, you have Lothal, but Harappa and Mohenjo-daro were the major cities because they were more sophisticated, and you got more sophisticated objects from there, so that we can say that it is the most advanced and most larger cities and sophisticated cities. And the Indus Valley civilization was very sophisticated because it had a proper agriculture, it had proper architecture, and architecture was built using brick, the baked brick, and the bricks were really uniform in size. So they are made. So they knew how to make the bricks, how to bake them, and how to make them in uniform shape and size. So all the architecture that you see are made out of the baked bricks, and the planning, the town planning was very sophisticated, and within the town planning, the organization of town was very sophisticated, and you have a very well laid out drainage system and water sewage system. Even they also had private toilets, and the sewage, the drainage was collected from the homes through the pipe channels, through the channels, and you have a proper laid out drainage system which was underground, which is not open to air, but which was underground. And along with the drainage system, they also had a separate rainwater drainage system. So it was a well organized, well planned, very sophisticated urban planning that we have in Harappa and particularly Mohenjo-daro. So which is why Indus Valley is one of the most sophisticated civilizations of that time. So it had a very active trade relations, and particularly with Mesopotamia, and we get to see many of the Indus Valley seals in Mesopotamia. So which is why we can say that there was a very active trade connection between Mesopotamia and Indus Valley region. So you have many kinds of crops that were cultivated. Cotton was one of the important crop, where cotton was traded with Mesopotamia, and sesame seeds, dates, peas, and rice was also one of the important crops at that point of time. So the middle phase, when you look at the middle phase, by 2500 BC, communities had been turned into urban centers. So you have in the middle phase is the matured phase. So in this particular phase, you have integration of centers takes place, integration of different communities takes place, integration of different cities takes place. So as I told you, over 1,000 cities were there. So around 1,052 cities and settlements have been found by the archaeologists. And when did Indus Valley was excavated and discovered by art historians or archaeologists? It is during the colonial times. It is in the late 19th century that the excavation of Indus Valley, that Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, and the region of Indus Valley was excavated around that time. And the archaeologists found that it is very sophisticated, so they were really surprised about finding such a sophisticated plan, because the excavated plan is still there, and the city plan can be seen by looking at the excavated areas that are still preserved by the archaeologists. So irrigation, one of the major tasks, one of the major challenges for the early civilizations, that may be Indus Valley or Egypt or Mesopotamia, one of the major challenges is to control water, because these rivers along which they were living, these rivers were really violent, in the sense they would flood almost every year or every alternate years. So there were regular floods. So what these people had to do was to control the flow of water, right? So they have channelized the water, they have controlled the water through a complex irrigation system, and use that water to increase the crop, right, for the production of crops. So water control mechanism is very important. So we can see that water control mechanism also in Mesopotamia, how they have built bridges to control water, and also in the context of Indus Valley we have evidence of mechanisms building for controlling the water. So that is the major task, and after that you can have settlements, you can have you can enlarge and expand your settlement. So water controlling mechanism had to be first put in place, which they have done. So some of the artifacts are very important for us to understand, and to understand these civilizations, the early civilizations, as I told you, what we have is these artifacts. Through these artifacts only we can understand how they lived, what are the cultures that existed in different cities, and what are the ritual practices that they were doing. So cremation of human remains. So the human remains were kept in pots and burial urns, right? So before the cremation, before the later phase, so cremation is in the later phase, as you can see here, the later phase of Harappa, and much of the cultural understanding of these regions we find from the burial chambers actually, and which is Egypt is a very good example for that. So here we found pots. Pottery is a very important material for us. So reddish pottery painted in black with antelopes and different animals and birds and different symbolic motifs like sun, star, and different kinds of textures, and the pottery becomes more sophisticated as the time grows. And the expansion of settlements into east, so what happens in the later phases, towards the east the settlements expand and rice became a main crop. So by the later phase we see rice, the production of rice increases. So major cities are Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, right? So the cities are well known to for their impressive, organized and regular layout. If you look at the layout, the planning of the of the cities, they are really well laid out, well organized. They have well laid plumbing and drainage system, right, including indoor toilets. Over 1,000 years, other towns and villages also existed in this region. So along with Mohenjo-daro, or around Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, we have other towns, smaller towns and villages existed. But what we have in Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, what we get to see is a very sophisticated urban planning can be seen there. So these are the two cities that you see, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. So trade, as I told you, trade with Mesopotamia and trade with southern India, trade with Afghanistan and Persia, was very active, and we can see all these, we can understand this by the spread of seals. We found the seals in Mesopotamia, in southern India and other regions, and gold, silver was traded, and lapis lazuli was an important material that was also traded. So important beads for jewelry was traded. So as I told you, it was a fertile land, and the land was used for agriculture purpose. So walls were built, as I told you, earthen walls were built to control the river's annual flooding. And the civilization was the first to cultivate cotton for the production of cloth, which was again traded with Mesopotamia. Several animals were domesticated, including elephant, and elephant, the ivory from elephant was used for ivory carving. So this is the plan, this is the archaeological site that we still have, and you have a great bath over there. The most important architecture and the most sophisticated architecture that we see in Mohenjo-daro is this bath, the Great Bath, which is called the Great Bath, because it appears as if they had a community bathing system. So Great Bath assumed the centrality in the plan of the city Mohenjo-daro, and this is another example of the excavation site, and it is very sophisticated, and the bricks and all this that you can see in the slide. And they also have these wells, as you can see there, the round at the center, it is a well for the water. Right, this is an example of the drains, and the drains that are covered underground, both for the rainwater drainage system as well as the general drainage system. This is an important seal. So there are a number of seals that we have found. This is a very famous seal called Pashupati seal, and it in the center, and this is called Shiva by some of the art historians. This is compared with Shiva because of his posture, and he's wearing a headgear which looks like the buffalo horns, and he's sitting right in the center, and on the one side you have a buffalo, and on the other side you have a tiger, and you have some script on the top. So all these seals, if you look at, all these seals have a central image in the center, and you have some text, some script on the top. So the script is difficult. It is, the historians are still trying to decipher what the script is, but yeah, the animals are symbolic here, as well as the script has some meaning which needs to be deciphered. This is another seal of Mohenjo-daro, figure grappling rampant tigers. So these seals are used in business actually, like we have rubber stamps now. These seals worked as rubber stamps actually, and these seals are negative, as you can see here. This is a positive, this is also a positive, but these seals are negative, and this is a negative. So negative in the sense you can put clay, wet clay, and you can take a positive impression out of it. So these seals are very small, but on the screen you see a bigger image, but these seals are very small, and these seals are used to take impressions, to give impressions. So we have many seals like this. You have the animal and you have a script on the top. This is an important sculpture that we found. It is called as priest king, and this shows that there may be a person who was important, an important figure, a head of the city maybe, or the priest who was controlling who was determining or who was dealing with the religious practice over there. So this is again a name given by the art historians later, but we don't know whether he was called as a priest or not, or priest king or not. So whether we don't know whether he is a priest as well as king or not, but it looks like he's an important figure, where you have a shawl that he is wearing, he has a beard, and the beard and shawl are treated with a schematic treatment. You have beard treated with straight lines, linear straight lines. It's not like hair, 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 hair, very linear, very neat kind of a treatment, but the face is very well captured. So this is done in steatite, fired steatite. It's a very small figure that we have from Mohenjo-daro, and this is again a very small figure from Mohenjo-daro. It's called dancing girl. It is in bronze, and this is an example of bronze which shows that the Indus Valley people knew how to do bronze casting, and the figure tells us the understanding of bronze casting because of its slender shape, right? So this particular sculpture is very different because of its treatment and because of its material, and this is very different because of its material. This is bronze and it is more slender, and dancing girl is a name given by the later historians. This is another small sculpture carved in red sandstone. So we have three materials now. This is just a torso, but if you look at the torso, the understanding of flesh, the understanding of physiognomy is very convincing. It's very sophisticated. The way the stomach is bulged, the way the figure is, the body is standing, the understanding of anatomy, the understanding of the look of flesh is very, very convincing. We get to see such figures extensively, and these are called mother goddess figures or fertility figures, and largely these are terracotta figurines, and these are done with pinching technique, what we call pinching technique. You take clay in your hand and you use your fingers and use basic tools, and by pinching you create a form. Unlike, let us say, this, where you carve and you make a very detailed appearance of the figure. Here it is not very detailed, but it is very simplistic, it is very minimal, very rough, and this is another example of the same. So we have a set of potteries, and pottery is an important material when you look at any civilization, and you have different shapes of pots and jars that we found. Pots were used for water, for grains, storage of grains. So this is an example for storage of grains, where these pots are extensively painted with animal forms, with geometric forms, and this particular pottery called ochre pottery is very famous from Indus Valley civilization. So sometimes you have a combination of geometric treatment as well as the animal, as well as the animal forms, something like this, the fish form. And this is a storage jar, which is a larger jar where a human figure can fit in. So the pottery was very complex, and the Indus Valley people could really make big, very large pots, and grains used to be stored in these large pots. And this is the final example that we have. This is a cart, and this shows about their transport system. You have a bullock cart here, and a very sophisticated understanding of making a cart, and bullock cart was used not only for transportation but also for the agricultural purpose. So we have seen with some examples from Indus Valley civilization how through these examples we can understand the sophisticated nature of Indus Valley civilization, and Indus Valley civilization is considered to be one of the greatest civilizations, the early civilizations that existed on the earth. Thank you.